This video is sponsored by Squarespace. When this camera was first launched, many people thought this was going to be the future of digital photography. It's called the Samsung Galaxy NX, and although from the front it may appear like a typical DSLR style camera, when you turn it around you can see that this really isn't a typical design at all. Firstly, there's a huge 4.8-inch touchscreen on the back that completely dominates the camera, with very few physical buttons or dials to be seen. But when you turn it on, it gets even weirder because, yeah, that's right, this is operated by Android. Granted, a very old version of Android, but Android nonetheless. And essentially, I think this is what happens when a mirrorless camera and a tablet make sweet, sensual love. Now, as you can probably guess, there are some pretty big advantages to owning and shooting with a camera like this, particularly if you're a content creator or you just like sharing your images online. And that's because not only does this allow you to capture super high quality images, but you can also edit them and upload the results to all of your social media channels, all just using this one single smart device. But considering this was released over 11 years ago and the majority of cameras today just don't look or operate anything like this one, that should be a fairly big red flag that this thing didn't work out to be the revolutionary camera everyone thought it was gonna be. But why? Well, let's start with the positives. As I've kind of already touched on, one of the biggest benefits to owning this camera over a regular smart device like your smartphone or a tablet would be the increased image quality. And that's because not only does this benefit from interchangeable lenses, but right behind that glass is a large APS-C size sensor. Now, this chip would absolutely dwarf the one found inside your smartphone today, and although size isn't everything,
that's what she said.
Physics dictates that having a larger sensor does ultimately result in things like better low light performance and better, more refined details in your images. But of course, we will talk more about image quality a little bit later on. Now, at the time of this camera's release, Samsung had already developed its own range of interchangeable lens cameras using the company's homegrown NX lens mount. Though this camera and lens range was also fairly short-lived, despite producing some pretty awesome little cameras, and if you want to learn more about that story, be sure to check out this video that I made about it up here. This Galaxy NX, as the name clearly suggests, uses the same NX lens mount, meaning that it's compatible with a whole range of focal lengths, so it can be easily adapted to shoot just about any style of photography. Currently though, I only have one lens for this camera, and that's this 30mm f2, which is small, lightweight, and pretty dependable in a whole range of situations. But even with this small lens attached, this thing is far from being pocketable. It would even struggle to fit in most jacket pockets. Although if I turn the camera sideways, you can see it's actually pretty thin for a camera of this size and spec. The height and width are largely the result of the huge touchscreen on the back. That said, its larger DSLR style frame means that it does have a very nice, deep and comfortable hand grip to shoot with, and they even managed to squeeze in an EVF and a pop-up flash on the top here too, which is a nice touch. But with barely any buttons or dials to speak of, that means that practically all of the shooting controls have to be altered using the rear touchscreen. So what's it actually like to shoot with? Well, before we can talk about any of that, we first need to mention today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. Now, whether you're a total beginner or a seasoned veteran, every photographer needs a high quality website to showcase their work. And I've personally been using Squarespace to build and host a whole number of websites over the years. And that's largely because I have next to no experience building websites, but with the huge range of templates on offer and its simple drag and drop interface, it's never been easier to create a professional looking website in just a matter of minutes. So if you want to get started, simply head over to squarespace.com/Tom Calton to save 10% off your first purchase of either a website or a domain using the code Tom Calton. And thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode and supporting the channel. Now, despite this essentially being a tablet with a DSLR glued to the front of it, it's actually really nice to shoot with. The touchscreen is super responsive and the sheer size of it feels very luxurious when you're composing your shots. Now, obviously in harsh sunlight, it is going to glare quite a bit, but luckily there is always the EVF to fall back on, which might not be quite as large and luxurious as the screen, but you'll certainly be glad it's there when you need it. Obviously, you can tap the screen to focus and take a photo if you want to, though there is also a physical shutter button on the top here for those who prefer the more traditional way of shooting. As this red button right next to it should indicate, it can also record video too, but only very basic 1080 HD up to 25 frames per second or 50 frames per second in 720 HD. Honestly, I really am struggling to find things to complain about on this camera, but if I was going to moan about anything, it would be that there is only one physical command dial on the top here, despite there seemingly being plenty of room to put a secondary one. And that means that when you're shooting in one of the semi or full manual modes, it can get a bit fiddly because you have to use the rear screen to change the shooting parameters, but you do kind of get used to it after a while. Just like any other camera of this kind of spec, it can shoot in RAW or JPEG or both at the same time, and although Samsung only made room for a single micro micro SD card slot and not a full-sized one, there is a fair amount of internal storage space, which does help to speed up the write times a little bit. But what's really interesting is that right next to the micro SD card slot on the bottom is a port to insert a SIM card. Now, this was obviously put in there so that you can simply insert a SIM card with a mobile data plan, and then you can access the internet via the camera whilst you're on the move. Though these days this feature is a little bit redundant because it's just way easier to create a mobile hotspot on your smartphone and then tether the camera to that in order to connect to the internet without having to bother with a separate SIM card or data plan. Now, as I said at the very start of this video, the image quality captured by this camera is very impressive considering its age. The raw files it captures are just as flexible and easy to work with as any modern day camera, displaying lovely colors and bags of detail. The autofocus was fairly quick and quiet, despite hunting on the very odd occasion, but overall, it's certainly a very capable and fun camera to use. Now, you might be wondering at this point, did I edit these raw files using the camera itself? And the answer to that would be a resounding no! Unfortunately, the current version of Lightroom just isn't compatible with this older version of Android, which is a little bit of a shame. In fact, it seems a lot of apps don't seem to work on this thing anymore, so the main selling point of this camera is no longer a selling point. And this leads us nicely onto the reason why this type of smart camera design just never saw a successor and the whole idea kind of faded into obscurity. In fact, it's the same reason why the phone you're using right now will probably one day become a brick and borderline unusable. And that's because eventually the hardware inside of it will become so outdated that it will become incompatible with future software updates and apps, and therefore it's no longer fit for purpose. Meaning that despite this being, I think, a really cool idea with lots of practical benefits, it has a relatively short shelf life. And considering that this thing cost $1,500 at the time of launch for the body only, that's a pretty hefty chunk of cash to put towards a camera that's almost guaranteed to stop functioning over time. Now, you certainly could argue that regular digital cameras will also age and become less valuable over time, but the big difference is that so long as they are well maintained, they should still continue to function as well as they did when they were first purchased. My Leica M8, which I keep talking about in multiple videos, is around 19 years old now, but even today in 2024, it still works as well as it did when it first came off the assembly line. It not being reliant on constant operating system updates means that this thing has stood the test of time, whilst this thing has much less functionality than it once did. Of course, that's not to say that this Galaxy NX is totally useless, because it still takes incredible photos and is still very fun to use. It just wasn't quite the revolution everyone was hoping for.